Good evening, everybody. Welcome and thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Professor Bradley Williams, Pro Vice Chancellor for University Impact at the University of Wollongong. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to one of our Meet the Researchers events. Before I introduce this event to you, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of knowledge and of the lands on which we meet, both here in person and for those of you online, and pay my respect to elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who may join us this evening. So the Meet the Researchers is a series of events where we are demonstrating an effort from the institution to bring our research into the public sphere, showing that the work that we are doing is not just for scholarly benefit, but is actually for societal and environmental benefit too. So it's about translating what we do into benefit and into impact. And this series of events, we take all around all of our campuses. We have 9 campuses in New South Wales. And so we take these events around the campuses to be able to engage more deeply with the communities and with the precincts in which we have a campus footprint. We don't necessarily burden our poor researchers with having to go to all of those campuses, so we do rotate, and in that way we can bring a variety of the type of research that we are doing to those particular precincts. Now, as I said, this event is intended to increase connectivity and increase the discussions and increase the interface between the institution and the public and industry and government. So that is enough about me and about this event, and let's get to the main part of it now. And I'm going to introduce Associate Professor Owen Price, who's the Director of the Centre for Environmental Risk Management and Bushfire at the University of Wollongong. He has been in that role for 17 years and has been researching the evidence and impacts of bushfires on biodiversity and buildings, and building the effectiveness of strategies to reduce bushfire risk. Associate Professor Price is in the School of Earth and Atmospheric Life Sciences at the university. Owen, over to you.
Thanks, Bradley. I'd also like to acknowledge country and get straight into it. So everybody has an opinion about bushfire, what to do about it, what causes it, what it does to the environment. But you can't make good decisions about bushfire management unless you've got a good evidence base. So this evening, I'm just going to try and run you through a brief outline of what the evidence base is. And I've broken my talk into these 4, pardon the pun, burning questions. First thing is it true that fires are increasing in activity? And what exactly is going on to cause that? This is a particularly scientific problem, which is there a positive feedback that's making things worse? And I'll go on to explain a bit about that. And then lastly, what can we do about it? So climate change and fire isn't my primary research focus. I'm sort of on the edge of this. I do lots of research into bushfires in general. And so I come across the climate change action aspect of it, because you can't avoid it when you're dealing about what to do about things and what the impact is. Okay, so to answer the first question, is fire increasing? So the 2019-20 fires, which you can see the fire map on the left-hand side, was the worst in New South Wales recorded history. A vast amount of the forest burnt. And you can investigate this in a variety of different ways. So one of a recent scientific paper that came out simply plotted the area that gets burnt by fire in the Eastern Australia every year, as can be seen from satellite imagery. And you can see here that the data set they've got goes back about 30 years. That's not a very long timeline for understanding complicated dynamics, things like bushfire. So climate change itself, you only see signals after many, many decades of trends or of data collection. So this is a short data set. You also notice another thing, very obvious thing about this data set is this one point up here. That is the 2019-20 bushfires. It's off the scale in terms of how much got burned. And the problem with that is that with a short data set and some extreme outliers like that, they have a lot of influence on what you think the trend is, what you decide the trend is. And so that there is the trend line. It does show that fire is increasing. And in fact, in this data set, they found a positive trend, even if you took that 1 year out. Here's another way to look at it. So I was involved in some research back nearly 10 years ago now, which was looking at state-based fire records, so areas that got burnt. And this data goes back to, say, 1975. We have good records back then. We're finding the same sort of thing. So the areas in red there are parts of New South Wales where there's a statistically significant increase in bushfire over that period. And of course, that doesn't include this massive year, 2009, 1920. You can go back even further than that. And so people have looked at charcoal records back to, say, 70,000 years and looked at the trends. Now, they're not actually looking at fire itself, but proxies of fire. So it's things like charcoal. You don't really know what's going on, but this is some evidence that fire has been around for a very long time. And it hasn't really changed a great deal over that time. And the other thing to say is, well, there's not just evidence from Australia, but these kinds of trends are happening around the world. So this is just a graph of a recent study from California, where you're seeing a very similar trend of increasing fire over the years. So to answer the question, is fire increasing? Yes, it is. Definitely is increasing around the world. So the next question, obviously, is what's causing the increase in fire? So I've broken this question into three possible answers. Lack of fuel management, change in human settlements, and climate change and weather. So first I'll talk about lack of fuel management. Every time there's a really bad fire season, a lot of people, a substantial minority of our community says the reason it happened is because we're not doing enough prescribed burning. So this is a prescribed burn. It's a deliberately managed fire put in place in a high-risk area to take the fuels out so that a bushfire that comes subsequently won't burn through there or will burn through it at a lower severity. There's actually now a lot of scientific study on the effectiveness of prescribed burn. So we actually know how this works in terms of reducing your bushfire. This is a graph that's just showing in the run-up to the 2019-20 bushfires, how much area had been burnt by prescribed fires in New South Wales each year in that run-up period. And the take-home here is that it's fairly consistent. The 2019 fires was not preceded by a lack of prescribed burning. It's not likely to be the cause. And also some of these studies you can produce graphs like this, which is basically saying, as you increase the amount of prescribed fire you do in the landscape, on the x-axis, you can work out how much you're going to reduce the area burnt by wildfires, bushfires on the y-axis. And this is actually a study that's been done on computers. It's a simulation study of simulated fire spread, but there are studies that are using actual historical fire records and they find almost the same thing. And that is to say that you have to do quite a lot of treatments to have much of an effect on reducing bushfire area, but it does work to some extent. The other interesting thing with this particular graph, which is the reason I showed it, is because this study, they tried to work out how much extra you would have to do in the future because of climate change. So you step from the dashed line to the black line as the climate gets worse in the future. And essentially it's saying that to tread water in terms of the amount of wildfire area, you're going to have to massively increase your prescribed burning effort if that's your main strategy to reduce your risk. So the answer is what's causing this increase in fire is it's not fuel or fuel management. So is it human settlements? So one of the interesting things about bushfires is most of them actually are started by people. Although interestingly enough, the 2019-20 fires were not. They were lightning. And this is a map of the number of ignitions. It's a hotspot map around the Sydney area. And you can see that what happens is there's big hotspots in areas where large populations are living next to the bush. Is that getting worse? Yes, it is. So this is a map of change in population around the Sydney area. So red areas are having more and more people quite rapidly. And although most of the new population is in the urban areas, which is not a bushfire risk, there's some of them is on more the fringes where you are going to start to see more lightning, more bushfire as a consequence. So there's some effect going on there. So I would say that increasing numbers of people are going to increase bushfire risk. But the main one is climate change and weather. And so I've answered yes already without giving you the evidence. So let's go to the evidence. So climate change and weather. So the first thing I wanted to say about this is that in 2019-20, which is the record for the amount of area burnt in forests, was also the worst on record in terms of weather. So for a major bushfire to occur, you need two basic things to happen. Everything has to be really, really dry, so the fuels are available to burn. And you have to have hot, dry, and windy weather. This map here shows in November 2019, the leaf moisture that you can actually record from the satellite was in large parts of New South Wales the driest it's ever been. So it was ready to burn. And then the second thing is the actual fire weather. So we commonly use this index called FFDI, Forest Fire Danger Index. And it's a combination of dryness, air dryness, humidity, wind speed, and temperature. And on this graph, it goes back to 1950. The purple area is basically the known bounds of the averages. So that's how it's been traveling. And the orange bars are the monthly averages. And I just want to highlight that that's our 2019-20 season. So it did go off the charts that year, but there's also an underlying trend, which is the dark red line. And the really worrying thing is in the last few years, that trend line has started to go outside the bounds of the historical range. This is very, very strong evidence that something's happening here. And lastly, climate predictions. They've been climate predictions for a long time now, and they've all been pointing in the same direction, and that is that the amount of fire caused by climate change is going to get worse in the future. So that is to answer the question, yes, climate change is the main driver of the reason why fire is increasing. Is there a feedback loop? So one of the things that happens, if you think about it, what we're saying is there's going to be more fires more often. They're probably going to be more severe or intense, so they're going to burn more fuel. So what that will do in the long term is it'll start to reduce the amount of fuel that's available there because they're burning more often. It won't have built up again by the time it burns. So maybe in the long term, the amount of fire will actually start to level off or drop back down again. Another aspect of this is that there's going to be less fuel growing because of drought. And we're pretty sure that under climate change, there's going to be less water available for plants. So even if rainfall doesn't decrease, and the climate change predictions are all over the place in terms of how much rain there is, if the rain stayed the same, but the temperature goes up, there's less water available for plants. So almost certainly there's going to be more drought. And so that's going to also reduce the amount of fuel. So maybe again, fire might be coming down. But there's a complicating factor, and that is CO2. Because it turns out that as CO2 in the atmosphere increases, plants can grow faster. And there is some evidence while they developed this idea in the lab, there's some evidence that things like eucalyptus will grow faster. So here's an experiment somebody did, growing seedlings with elevated CO2. The first set of points is under current conditions, current CO2, but drought. And the next one is with current CO2, but with plenty of water. The next one is elevated CO2, so the kind of CO2 levels that it will be like in 70 years' time, by 2070. And then and droughted, and then the last one is the same but with water. And basically what that shows is you give plants more water and they'll grow. If you give them more CO2, they'll grow better. So what we think might happen, we have no idea the strength of this effect when you actually look at it in the real world, in a forest. But possibly what might happen in the future is we'll get something like this. Temperatures going up over time, climate change. The fuels are likely to be going down over time. And maybe fire activity will therefore do something like this. It'll go up, and then towards the end of the century, it might start to come down again. But the problem is, that's going to be in a new kind of world where there's less fuel, and that means there's less animals and plants, there's less biodiversity. So it's a poorer world. So therefore, I've given you essentially all the evidence, what we know about what is going on, and what can we do about it? Well, I've already mentioned prescribed burning. You can increase the prescribed burning, but as I've said, you'd have to do an awful lot to try and even just stay level with what we are in terms of bushfire. Already lots and lots of money goes into fire suppression, so stopping a fire from having an impact once it gets going. It's extremely expensive. It's relatively effective, but one of the things you have to understand is when there's a fire burning under severe weather conditions, nothing will stop it. There's nothing you can do. Improved planning. So where you put your houses is important, and I'd say, considering the increased risk from climate change, it would be foolish to plan housing developments like this one in the lower Blue Mountains. So you can have housing developments that are safer than that. And then lastly, cultural burning. So cultural burning, while it's not intended to be a bushfire risk reduction method, it's done to for landscape health. It is quite possible that what with the renaissance of cultural burning in Eastern Australia, that this could help us in some way to reduce risk. What can you do yourselves? The first thing is, I think I've already mentioned, but houses can be built in a way that will resist fire. They can't completely be fireproof, but they can be a lot stronger. And we have a building code that sort of enforces this on you in certain circumstances. Prepare your garden very well so that it's not going to carry the fire to your house. Get ready to defend or go. In other words, as the Rural Fire Service would say, have a bushfire plan. And then lastly, I can't leave this without saying that none of these things that I've talked about are going to solve the problem of bushfire. It is going to get worse. And those things will take off the worst of the edges of it. What we actually have to do is try and make sure that the temperature doesn't go up too much. So we have these goals of 1.5 degrees. We're on track for something far worse, but we really need to limit that temperature rise to stop this getting too bad. And so obviously these are things like, personally, what you can do is try and sequester carbon, like what I do, go tree planting. That is actually to offset my flights that I take. We should support projects like the wind farm out here because that's a way of decarbonising and reducing greenhouse emissions. And with that, thanks for listening.
Thanks, Owen. Thank you very much. So Owen's presentation is open for questions, including for the people who've joined us online. And I might lead off with a question, Owen. You mentioned that the more historical understanding of these bushfires relates to charcoal analysis. Can you maybe explain a bit more how this is done? I'm a chemist, so I might be able to help you a little bit. But just if you can just maybe comment on how that is done.
Okay, so every time there's a fire in an environment like a forest, some of the tree material will actually get turned into charcoal, and that will be buried, will lay on the ground, and then that will be buried as the soil builds up. So what they do is they go to a place and do a soil core, go through and pick up 2 or 3 meters of soil, and with various techniques like carbon dating and other measures, they can date how long ago that soil was laid down, and then they can count up the amount of charcoal in those layers and go through and reconstruct the profile. The thing about that is it's a proxy for fire, but we don't understand what sort of a proxy it is. We're not even entirely sure if you see more of that, whether that meant there was more fire or less fire. Because if you think about it, if the fire was really, really bad, maybe it burns all the stuff away and leaves no charcoal. So it's a bit uncertain, but it does show you that there has been fire consistently for hundreds of thousands of years. In fact, it's thought we've got pretty good evidence that fire has been on the earth for 400 million years.
Yeah, pretty much as long as there's been plants, right? Right? Any questions from the floor? Please.
Yes, it's been almost 5 years since the 2019 fires. A lot of your graphs only go up to 2020. Is there any trend in what's happened since then, or you noticed any change in that trend through the last few years?
Nobody's really examined it, but the thing, what's happened is, we went into 2-3 very wet years in a row. We're not going to have any serious fire seasons under those circumstances. And also, of course, because the fires are so big, they burnt large areas will not burn again for a few years. Fuels will almost certainly recovered by now. So if we go back into drought, this year is not looking quite dry. So it's possible that this summer would be quite bad. It won't be anywhere near as bad as that year, because that was 3 years of the worst drought in history. So it won't be that bad, but it could get there if we don't get lots of rain.
Yeah. Another question? Is there any online? Nothing online. So maybe just a comment on my side. I mean, it was evident that there was a lot of this we know, this we're not sure of, and there's some uncertainty on this side of it. And I think it's a really nice embodiment of the sort of conservative approach that scientists should take, and why we are open to correcting ourselves. So as the evidence emerges, we are open to correcting ourselves, which some people interpret as being a bit flip-flop. Right? So now butter's good for you, and then it's not, and then it's vegetable oils and all the rest. But what we're doing, of course, is presenting the very best knowledge of the evidence that we have at our disposal. And when we find out that that happens to have been wrong based on later experimentation and work, then we correct that. So we're prepared to do that. And it's really good that it was implicit in what you were talking about. So really good. So what are the future steps? Where to from here?
I wanted to say, I mean, my field of research is not without controversy, even among the researchers. So we argue among ourselves about the effectiveness of prescribed burning. So, and if you go into areas like, aerial water bombing, it's such a complicated thing that trying to work out whether it's working or not it can cause a lot of arguments, and it's very hard to work out.
Yeah.
But
indeed.
sorry, what was your question?
Oh, the
What
future.
future
So what
steps?
is the future from here? From a scientific point of view, what would you say we don't know yet, and where we really need to focus?
I would say actually, I think I would have mentioned it, but some of these suppression techniques are, they're putting a lot of store in the area to stop fires, at least from burning down houses. And we have a very poor understanding about when it works and when it doesn't.
All right. Okay. A question. Oh, now we're getting going. Excellent.
I was just wondering if in the last 10 years, or especially in the last 5 years, with things like AI or different data processing technologies and also data acquisition techniques, how that's changing things and how that might change things within the next 5 or 10 years. Pretty big question, but maybe there's one or two good examples.
I think there's lots of good tech coming on to do things like mapping fuel. With high power computing, you might be able to get better understanding of how fires spread through fuel, so better predictive models. And then the last thing is having real-time intelligence about what's going on in a fire is really, really important, and high-tech stuff can help there. But we're talking about very, very expensive kit flying above the fire, or satellites. The satellites they have at the moment are not really quite up to the task. So with all these tiny arrays of satellites, you might have like real-time monitoring and basically everything. It's a bit scary, but it could help.
Yeah, some of the new imaging technologies, the resolution is improving very significantly, and what's known as hyperspectral imaging. So it's from infrared, which tells you there's fire, all the way through visible and ultraviolet. That's improving very significantly. And as Owen was saying, with these constellations of satellites, like them or love them, it doesn't matter, but they're there. With those constellations of satellites, the state government and the federal government have both looked at funding and challenges around early detection, early warning systems related to fires that actually have a small diameter and relatively low heat. So it's not easy, though. It's very difficult to do.
So the satellites that you're getting the photos from, what's the word? Is it geostationary? Or do they orbit? Maybe if there's so much increased impact and cost and things, the allocation of funding for satellites, things might also change. So the amount of time that's given to observing different things, or even putting things that can just look all the time, like you were saying.
So one of the ones that is quite useful is a weather satellite. Himawari takes a picture every 10 minutes, but it's geostationary. Problem with that at the moment is that it's really, really coarse, so it can't see these small fires. It can only see big ones.
I think you had a question.
Yeah, I just want to know how much input do scientists actually get into the fire, like the firefighters, what they actually do on the ground, because it seems to be a lot of the time when they do their burning, they're the ones that start fires and off they go. They seem to lose control of it very quickly. So how much is the research side going into the practical side for the people who are doing the burning? And where is that getting lost in the middle somewhere, or are they getting?
I wouldn't say it's getting lost. I'd say it takes a long, long time to get taken up. So that when they do prescribe burns, they're all using some guidance that was done, that they got from experimental fires that were done by scientists back in the 60s and 70s. They probably need to update what they do, but it kind of gets stopped eventually, but there's no obvious pathway to happen. It's this strange, slow process.
Yeah, that's often the case. There was a question at the back.
Yeah, a question about the scale of the spot fires, like when you said they were big or they were small, what was it actually measuring on a scale, like on the ground? Like how big were the fires?
Which one? Spot fires?
On one of your images, you had, probably don't want to go all the way back.
Oh,
these
there.
ones here.
Well, that's just the actual technical thing there is I took every ignition or every fire that I knew and then threw, I think, a 500 meters circle around it and then counted all the circles essentially.
Right, okay.
Yeah, so that wasn't necessarily detecting the fires, but going to known fires at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Right.
That wasn't detecting fires. That's like where somebody has gone to the bottom of actually mapping where they were.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And final question.
Thank you. I was intrigued by your graph showing the long-term trend. It's likely that we'll reach a peak of fires and then drop off as the weather increases in temperature. What's the worst case? Does that trend continue? The worst case for climate change is that we'll end up with what the dinosaurs had, with tropics at the poles and I guess a sauna around the equator. What would the fires be?
But I would remind you that there have been times when the world had 30% oxygen, whereas we now have 20% oxygen. When it's 30% oxygen, you just have to look at something and it burns. So we've been in very high fire periods in the past, and things all got through it. So in the Carboniferous period, when they had these dragonflies
Yeah.
this big, that's because there was 30% oxygen in the atmosphere, and there was a lot of fire.
I suppose the other thing is that climate change is not uniform across the planet. Some places will get drier, other places will get wetter, much drier and much wetter. For other places, it will just seem a bit balmy. It depends on where you are. So it's not a uniform event.
Some of the really scary things that are happening now is in Siberia and the tundra that never would have burnt in the past, but they are now.
Yeah. All right, Owen, thank you very much. Now it is a great pleasure to introduce Associate Professor Sonia Graham, who is a human geographer at the University of Wollongong. And she does her work in the Australian Centre for Culture, Environment, Society and Space, and is resident in the School of Health and Society. For over 10 years, Sonia has been studying the social impacts of sea level rise and associated adaptation policies. During her postdoctoral research, which for those of you who don't know, you get up to a PhD and then you go and slave for somebody in their lab and you do work for them for dirt cheap and you work very long hours. She and her colleagues developed a method that enables policymakers to identify which social values are likely to be affected by climate change and how to incorporate such values into adaptation plans. So Sonia will talk to us this evening about social impacts of human adaptation to rising sea levels. Sonia.
Thanks, Bradley. All right. So I'd just like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we are at the moment, the Dharawal, Wurundjeri and Yuin people, and also the traditional owners of the lands of the research that I'll be talking about today. That includes the Yuin, the Gwogal, the Biripi and the Gurna peoples. So when we talk about the impacts of climate change, we talk about phenomena like sea level rise and the impacts that it's going to have. One of the things that we often talk about are the impacts that those things are going to have on infrastructure. And so we talk about the height that sea levels might rise, figures like 80 centimetres by 2100 predicted to, what's predicted. We talk about the kilometres of coastline affected, and we also talk about the number of people who will be impacted by coastal flooding and rising sea levels. So by 2100, it's expected that 350 million people around the world will be at risk of coastal flooding. But the issue with this focus on numbers and this focus on infrastructure is it overlooks a really important part of everyday life in coastal places. It overlooks the social interactions, the emotions attached to places, the way we feel and sense and be in these places. And so what my research has aimed to do over the last decade is try to bring to the forefront of these discussions about climate change and how we adapt some of the more of those less tangible possible elements of what we're doing and think about how those things will impact and how we can account for them as we plan for the future. So we need to understand what the everyday lives are like of people who live along coasts, what they care about, how people and the things they care about could be affected by environmental changes, as well as the government policies designed to respond to them, as well as having a plan for the future that is based on protecting what people want to value the most. The research we do realises that adaptation is a complex process. It's not a straightforward thing to plan for the future. We are inherently, I think, a reactive sort of people. But this is what we really need to start thinking about. So we need to think about adaptation and the possibility it offers us to be something other than a technical process and a way in which it can make sure that we benefit everyone and not just the few who put their voices forward and have a say. So one of the things that I've been developing in the last few years has been what we call a values-based approach to adaptation. So here we try to centre the things that matter most to people. We try to set goals for adaptation based on these local values, and we want to make adaptation more equitable. So the idea of lived values are evaluations that people make, either by themselves or as groups of people, about what is important in the places where they live. So these might be things that they tell us in surveys and interviews, but it might also be expressed through everyday activities. So you can also observe people in place to see what it is that makes these places special. So we've been doing a range of interviews, surveys, observations, focus groups across a range of places in Australia and overseas, and ask them specifically what it is that they like about where they live, what frustrates them, because that can often give us some good ideas for policy and plans for the future, what activities they participate in, with who and where. And so this research has informed policy already. It was adapted in Townsville when they tried to make a plan for the future and realised that actually we need to start with a good understanding of what people like. So I think one of the key things that's valuable and useful about this approach is it tells us that actually there's a lot that people have in common in what they like about the coast. And having things in common is a really good starting point, especially for topics like climate change, where there can often be a lot of debate and conflict. But we need to start with what is it we have in common. So in research I've done across Southeast Australia, spanning from Old Bar in the north of that map all the way through to Tasmania, Kingston Beach, is that there's basically just a really small subset of things that almost everyone agrees on is what they value about the coast. And in some ways it's not surprising, right? So I've colour-coded there the maps with the things that were rated top in each of these places is what they like. The natural environment, the relaxed lifestyle, and the beach. And obviously there's overlap between these factors. And the three other things I've listed there, the friendly people, easy to get places and fishing are also really frequently mentioned. Recreational opportunities are really key. So I guess what's interesting about this is that just how consistent it is no matter where you are. So I've also done research in Spain and it's the same things that come up. So the more research we do in places, the more we can see that these things are really key. And so it gives us a starting point to have the conversations. What is also useful about this approach is that it gives us an understanding of the differences and where we don't agree or where particular people might have particular preferences. So when we've analysed the data on what people value about the coast, and believe me, there's lists often, if you give them a chance of having an open-ended question, we'll go into the hundreds. We can start to see groupings, not only in the types of things that people value, but also the particular people that value those things. So we've seen that what people value about the coast is dependent on their age, whether they're working or retired, their levels of social activity, whether they're business owners or volunteers, whether they've had a long-term family connection to a place is really key, whether it's their primary place of residence or their second home, whether they're a visitor just passing through on a holiday or a resident, actually even whether they're a homebody or an outdoor sort of person, whether they prefer the coast or the bush. And so knowing these things helps us to understand how vulnerable people are to the impacts of things like sea level rise and bushfires. What we find is particular sorts of people are attracted to particular types of places along the coast, whether it's the places where they gather, volunteer groups, go bushwalking, go for cafes, a place where they go with their family, or whether it's places where they undertake economic and business activity. And so this gives us a different way of seeing climate change and the potential impacts of sea level rise, because it takes the focus away just from people's places of residence, which is often a focus of our research on the climate impacts. When we look at bushfires, we look at climate impacts in people's homes. When we look at sea level rise, we look at how close people's houses are to the sea. But there are so many other places we use in our coastal areas that we need to think more broadly than just the impacts to people's homes. So that's one of the other things that this lived values approach does. What I have here is a map from just 4 people who we interviewed in Lakes Entrance. And these 4 people had fundamentally different ways of not only connecting to places local to them, but also further away. So it's a bit hard to see the different dotted lines here, but effectively there were some people who really stayed close to home and didn't go very far. There are others who basically only recreated in coastal places and others who preferred to go back into the hinterland. And so for each of these different ways in which people recreate, socialise, see family, they have different vulnerability profiles. And so we need to think beyond just where people live and the activities they do locally to where they go even further and the impacts that it might have. So what we know from the Black Summer bushfires, which we just heard about from Owen, Malakuta, I think most people who were here at the time will have a really sort of vibrant image in their mind of the people needing to go into boats and offshore to try and avoid the bushfires. So these communities are normally ones we think about for sea level rise, but we have these accumulating and compounding impacts that are converging on these places. And so we need to start thinking beyond single issues like sea level rise or bushfires and thinking about them together and what their combined effects are on people in the multiple places that they live and engage with. Beyond that, we also need to think about how people's values are likely to change over time. So these communities aren't static. So what we see in a lot of rural communities is a large influx of what we might call sea changes, people moving to the coast, into the retirement. And that also changes what it is that people like about these places and what they want to protect and see protected as they change as a result of sea level rise or other impacts. But it's not easy to think of a plan for the future and what we want a place to look like as flooding becomes more frequent or bushfires become more frequent. And I guess there's a lot of public debate about climate change and when we should act and how soon we need to act. And so part of the conversation we had in this project was trying to devise a process to do that slowly and over time, rather than doing a really big step change between now and a future that's not really quite here yet. And so one of the things that we did with my colleagues in Melbourne was talk about what they call a pathways approach, to saying we don't have to do everything in preparation for 2100 now. We can take steps along the way. But what we need to figure out is what is an acceptable change to those things that we like, that we're willing to accept, and at what point do we know we need to do something different. And so what we did in that research, we're trying to identify what the trigger points. So how many times does the main street in Lakes Entrance, which is where all of the main shops are, all of the cafes, the walkways, the picnic tables, the fish cleaning stations, how often does that need a flood before people want to see something different happen? And so that's what we started to develop. Is that once a year? Is that when it becomes so frequent that we need something to change? Is it twice a year? Is it less frequent? Is it once every 5 years? Is that the point at which people say, I've had to clean up my shop enough that actually I don't want to be doing that again in 5 years' time. Let's do something now. And so it's about having a plan for when that point comes. What do we do next? What are the first things we protect? Do we need to relocate infrastructure? Do we need to lift people's houses up? What are our options? And how do we protect these things that are valuable to us? So these things need to be done in conjunction with community. They need to be brought along the way and explained when and how these decisions are being made and what that future might look like. So that's where I'm really at, and that's, I guess, in some ways where the research is at in terms of coming to a process. And I guess part of the challenges we've had now is we've helped and identified what these values are, but it's not an easy conversation with communities to have about this place is going to change. How do we prepare for that? And so the next steps are about trying to develop methods for those difficult conversations. But what this approach does offer is giving us the information base we need to know about what diverse people in the community want, not just the ones who are the most vocal, the ones writing submissions, but everyone. And so that's why the research is important, because it is capable of reaching a broader conversation, a broader community. We also realise that we need a plan for each coastal community. So while the general trends in sea level rise might be similar, or the increase in trends in bushfire might be similar across Australia, each individual place will have a unique population with a unique history and a unique way of seeing on what they want for the future. So it really needs to be done at that local scale. And we need to take into account multiple impacts of climate change, not just the single issues. Why this matters? Well, one of the stats that a lot of people who work in this area really love is that 80% of Australians live within 50 kilometres of the coast. A lot of us love recreating there, and so even if you don't live there, it's something that's really something we care about and want to do, something to protect or make sure that those things that we love about the coast persist into the future. The picture at the top there is from the seawall in Collaroy in Sydney, which obviously there was a lot of protests around at the time at which that was proposed, and continue to be protests as they continue to try and expand and extend the seawall. So conflict has really been a key way in which communities have engaged with the idea of sea level rise and the possible solutions. And we need to find a solution. We can't have the same conversation and conflicts along every coastal community in Australia. There needs to be a better way of doing this. And the other picture I've got there is actually from the airport in Barcelona, which is also right on the coast and where we did some research. And similarly, there was conflict there at the proposal of adding a third runway because of the impacts on the wetland and the poor community that lives nearby. That's their access to the beach and to nature. And it's also a European significant wetland. So these questions and conversations and processes aren't just unique to Australia, they are happening all over the world. So how do we reconcile with this as a society? Planning processes here and overseas often really aren't equipped to have these emotional conversations. So how do we bring those emotions sensitively into the conversation? The difference it can make is the lived values approach really helps because it shows us what we all care in common about a place. So that's a really good place to start. I do research on collective action as well. If you have a shared starting point, a shared goal and shared value, that's a really great way to start building a collaborative and connected approach. So communities, this is a very accessible sort of a method. This is something communities can take up and run with. And if they do, they can highlight the different things that are important to these places beyond what it might be that different decision makers and planners are seeing. That's a picture there from Olba, where there's a group that's really active in trying to find a solution to what has been a massive change in their coastal, their beach area over the last 50 years. Governments can also use this approach to engage with a whole range of people beyond those who are the ones that come to community forums or who write submissions to really get a sense of what the broader community wants and needs. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Sonia. This is such important work, and it does certainly demonstrate the value of getting people involved and engaging people respectfully. So no one likes to be told what to do and when to do it, and so being part of that process is really important. And I see that you have a guide for government. Can you maybe explain what the core message is when it comes to interacting with government about the work that you've done?
Yeah, I think it's about trying to encourage them not to be afraid to have that conversation with community. I think there's been a lot of people who feel burnt in a way by trying to open up these conversations, but I still think they're really important to have. And so a lot of this is about trying to focus on the values and trying to find that from ground, because that's, I guess, what we did with that research was take it out of a conversation about climate change to start with, to make it a conversation about values, and then you can bring the other elements into it.
Yeah, I suppose it's really bringing it home as opposed to something that's kind of nebulous.
Yeah.
So without doubt, we've all been subject to some form of exposure, fear, when it comes to things like floods and the bushfires.
Yeah.
And framing it from a personal point of view and then bringing it home to something that a bit bigger picture is a great way of doing it.
And I think it also then builds on people's experiences. So I think there's a mismatch between the science that says, oh, sea levels are going to rise by 80 centimetres and people's everyday lived experience. And some of these communities experience king tides and are used to not being able to get out of their house or out of their community on a semi-regular basis. And so they know that they're able to adapt. And so how can we marry up that local knowledge about what's acceptable and normal with what might look really different?
Yeah, in some places you just go up the beach, you can see the houses already hanging off of the edge of what was once solid ground. To know that it influences people differently. Questions from the floor? Please, at the back.
You were talking about how you're engaging with communities beyond those kind of vocal minorities, the ones that will show up to town halls and write submissions. Just wondering how you're doing that within the federal.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it's required going beyond just sending out the survey. Sometimes it's been, some things work in some ways easier when people had phones, and then that way you could just call people. That's become a lot harder. And so now it's much harder to do that sort of representative research like we might have once done. So it's actually sometimes about having personal relationships and connecting with the individual community groups that represent those different people, whether it's engaging with the local Indigenous groups. In Lakes Entrance, we did it through the Indigenous Health Organisation, and just trying to reach them in different ways, but actually being in places and then going to the places where people might be and starting the conversation.
It is such an important point that you make, because often enough, the voice that we hear is the voice that we hear. Right? And there are many people, but we only hear the voice that we hear. And it's really important to get that information from everybody who would like to say something, but doesn't necessarily have that loud and prominent voice. You have a question?
Thank you. Yes, it's an interesting area of research, Sonia. I'm intrigued by the public opinion on things to do with climate change. For instance, the offshore wind farm issue, where there's a lot of what people perceive as might affect their lifestyle. And so the thought that beaches might be in some ways damaged by sea level rise, or probably certainly will be a really close thing, close to people's hearts, locally especially.
Yeah.
So have you done any research on what the reality of sea level rise will do to beaches and what impact it would actually have over the next 80 years?
I haven't, because I guess, I'm mostly focusing on the social side of things, and when others are doing that sort of research about how the natural environment is changing. So for example, though, like Lakes Entrance was a useful place to study because someone had invested the time and effort in doing the flood map. And so you could actually sit alongside the community and basically increase the level of the water and show them what the predictions were about what and where was going to be flooded. But then you have to marry it with their own experiences. So we sat in the workshop and had maps out of Lakes Entrance and asked them for their experiences of where had flooded and what impact that had on that. And I think the key thing there is people's experiences. So in those communities that I've dealt with before, the ones like Old Bar, where they've witnessed, because of the nature of that, the beach in that place, a lot of coastal erosion, they've been much more proactive in demanding the solution from government, because they can see what's going to happen, and houses have started, being impacted, and people have just started taking the initiative and building their own sort of seawall, basically, in the absence of government doing something. In other places where they don't see that and they haven't noticed an impact, then the pushback is a lot more serious. So there's also that element of people's perceptions and own experiences that determines their willingness to engage and accept some of the solutions that are proposed.
But it occurs to me that because of a lot of the property along the coastline is private property, as we lose the beaches and the private property into cities, we will have no beaches. Or does the sand naturally come up and rise above everything to give us new beaches as the sea level rises? I guess that's an area outside your research. Do you know the answer to that, or has anybody studied on where we will go?
I don't have an answer to that. I can point you to some information which was provided on Thursday at Jeff's lecture as a sort of who will be talking about, changes to mangroves with rising seas. And yeah, so I think you might be a better person to.
Yeah, so we will have a similar event on Thursday evening across at our Innovation Campus, and I invite you to join us there. You'll find it at more or less the same place where you found this event. And one of our researchers there, Jeff Calloway, he talks about this particular point, not in the beaches particularly, but about the coastal zone. And his focus is on mangroves in specific, but you can take some generalizations away from that particular message. So I will invite everybody to that event as well and register. The registrations are still open. Are there any questions online?
Not a question, but a comment from Susan, who says, just want to say thank you for a clear, informative presentation. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Right, there was a question.
Yeah, if you could go back to the diagram showing the sea level rise over time. I was just wondering what sort of curve we're actually going to be expecting. That one. Yeah. What sort of curve is it actually going to be? You know, it's not linear.
No, it's not linear. The latest I've seen is that sea level rise is accelerating, and so I guess that would suggest a more exponential curve than might be suggested there. Antarctic sea ice levels are at an all-time low. Like, it's one of those things where we know it's increasing, and I guess it's a bit like Owen. It's like we know it's increasing. Can we exactly say by how much or in what nature? Then that's a much more difficult thing, I think.
And I also wondered if the experience of people in places like Lismore with repeated floodings is that some type of a good model for what people are going to expect? Like, you gave the example of a shopkeeper who might get, the way you said it from memory, is that they would get tired of, one time in 3 years might be tolerable, one time in 5 years, but isn't the limit in places like Ballina actually things like insurance and just the actual financial viability of rebuilding? And by the time you get to that point, your property is actually worthless.
Yeah, look, I think you've hit it on the head right there. Like, and a lot of the people we talk to in interviews, one of the things that they talk about is insurance, and that's actually an indicator for them around the issues about whether to buy in certain places. A number of people we talk to, like, you know, I don't have to worry about it because I bought on a hill. So there's definitely already, you know, coming into people's thinking around what they're doing, but insurance is definitely one thing that's, you know, people talk about how much premiums had increased, and I think you're right, and I think also, like, I think Lismore does indicate just how quickly some of these things can change and how much we can quickly hit a tipping point, probably even bump a few along the scale really quickly, and so it's that tension between doing it at a scale in which you bring people along, but also not leaving it so late that, you know, the impacts are so severe that it's really hard to come back from.
I live in rural Austinmere, and I always think, you know, this road at Austinmere near the car park, how many times would that have to be taken out? And that just removes any access for people to get into Wollongong unless they go right around. So, I mean, what's the point where it starts to be financially and all of these things sort of snowball?
And they're the conversations we really need to have, and we kind of keep avoiding them because they're hard conversations and there's no easy answers.
Yeah.
But at some point, that's going to be a reality, right? So, you know, if we can have thought about it and have plans in place earlier, then it makes it easier when the time comes. We're like, oh yeah, it's time to do that.
So that's where there is a need for some sense of bringing it back to home for individuals, but also from scientists and councils and governments to identify points of failure. The road that you just mentioned is a potential point of failure. If it goes down, you really have a long trek all the way around the national park to get into Wollongong. So there is some sensitivity analysis that needs to go into, but then also the personal side, such as insurance is off the charts. I'm ready now, and that's part of the game.
Yeah, and we end up with all these underinsured people too, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Yes.
Thank you. It really concerns me that all of these graphs don't ever seem to be tailing off. That one there, for instance, it's on a...
Well, this one's completely hypothetical.
Yes. But like, nobody's suggesting sea level rise won't continue, and like every indication shows it's going to continue, and it continue accelerating probably. So that's going to be a huge impact on the likes of the coastline here. If you look at the whole of Antarctica melting, it takes away all of Shell Harbour and half of Wollongong. You look at the maps, really up above the hospital level, for instance, will be gone. Here, this would be gone long ago. So is that in the future? And how much, this is something for you, Sonia, how much do people worry about their grandchildren and their children or do they just worry about their own, you know, lifetime?
I couldn't tell you the number of times I've done interviews where people have said, I'll be gone by then, it doesn't really matter, despite having kids and grandkids. Yeah, I think, you
It's
know.
like people looking at the warning on a cigarette packet.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you very much live in the here and
Picture,
now.
ugly picture of someone with
Yeah.
mouth cancer, but yeah, whatever.
Yeah. Which kind of brings us back to some of the comment that Owen was making, is that there is structural responsibility, but there's also personal responsibility. And to live as though there's no tomorrow is not responsible. Owen, you had a question.
Yeah, it'd be nice to have some examples of what the community actually wanted to do, or what the government ended up doing, or, and you had that example from Old Bar
Yes.
with the map that they had in the poster. So what did they do? What was that plan?
So Old Bar is a really interesting case because the community and the local government proposed a retreat policy, which is often not very popular policy. So houses were starting to fall in the sea, and what they said is, could you please allocate some land? And there is, you know, a large stretch of sort of bush behind Old Bar that is for the purpose of resettling people whose houses are no longer viable on the coast. And then there was a state government process, and they actually did a feasibility study on a break wall, which was going to cost $55 million for a community of 6,000 people. So you can do the maths on as to whether that was feasible or not. The local community was suggesting a reef as one sort of an option to try and, you know, slow the process. But basically what ended up happening was they literally left Old Bar off the coastal management planning map. It was too hard.
That's the solution, just forget about it.
Yeah.
We'll come back to it later. We'll need its own plan. In the short term, we've got to just get on and get our map out. So this is the thing, we can't leave it like that, right? And that's not the solution. So how do we have those conversations? Yeah.
Are there also any studies, because the other thing that you notice is that all natural sort of flood and tide defences, estuaries, lagoons and stuff just get eradicated for parks, and there are some that exist, but are there studies that compare the differences between places? And like I know Tarul and Ostamere, for example, all of the lagoons and things are turned into parks or swimming pools or places where those things still exist.
Yeah, no, there is absolutely work on that. And again, I'm going to point you to Thursday's talk with Jeff, just because I know you're actually going to be talking about nature-based solutions as a way of dealing with these sorts of challenges.
Right, last question.
One
One more online. Okay.
You were talking about the relocation idea, and that was from government and community.
Yeah.
Was there anything in there about like the idea of buybacks and things like that? So buying back the land and the properties and things, so to enable those people to move, like have that relocation? Because I know after like the floods in Queensland and things, they did do that around some of those areas, and there was a lot of contestation about that issue because some people obviously didn't want to move. And
yeah, I can't remember the specifics in the case of Old Bar. I mean, it's got to be part of that conversation. And it's part of the conversation, right? Where does the responsibility sit? At what point is that government's job to buy people out? You know, especially at this point where we're saying this is what predictive impacts are. If you buy into an area where it's a bit like buying into a bushfire, high bushfire risk area too, right? So that hasn't been clearly nutted out, and I think that's one of the challenges with Old Bar is, and I think, you know, with these sorts of places that are reaching this point now, is setting a precedent. I think there's concern in governments around setting precedents in these sorts of places, and so I think this is how you get left off the map. Is how do you not set a precedent but also deal with this particular situation?
too hard basket.
All right, question online.
The question is from Jody, and Jody asks, I believe we have had some of the first climate change refugees from PNG, but are there any other countries experiencing this need to relocate like they have? Do you know?
So I remember at Melbourne Uni, President of Kiribati came and talked about this exact concern. So I think there's definitely a lot of the low-lying states across the Pacific who are having these conversations, and there's definitely a stack of researchers in the social space too who are working with these communities trying to figure out what do you do. Yeah.
All right, well, thanks everyone for joining us. Thank you, Owen. Thank you, Sonia, for these somber but insightful and forward-leaning presentations. Yeah. Thanks to everyone who joined us online as well. Hope that it's been insightful to you all. And for those who are online, thank you very much. For those who are in the room with us, there are some light snacks at the back. Please stay behind. Talk to our researchers if you like. Thank you very much.